Hi everyone, this is Miss Moriarty and I'm here to discuss with us our topics 5.10 and 5.13 in our land and water use unit. So here we go. Now, with our land and water use unit, right, so far we have discussed how we happen to use water on Earth. We know that we use it majority for agricultural purposes, industrial purposes, as well as domestic use. We've talked about the creation of food, how we use it in agriculture, and all that good stuff, as well as forestry, right? How do we use things like lumber and timber? Now, we also know when using land, we tend to use it for things like housing. So in this video, I'm going to talk about urbanization and urban sprawl and what those things mean and how it affects surrounding ecosystems. So in topic 5.10, we can see the impacts of urbanization. We know removes vegetation from a given piece of land. And it converts that natural landscape oftentimes to a city or more urban type landscape. So you can kind of see here, we have a natural habitat here. We see that we have water cycle going on here. We have water going into the ground. We have minimal runoff because we have some vegetation here. Plants and trees work to absorb that storm water. We know that with all of this vegetation, we have good cycling of nitrogen and phosphorus as well as carbon, even though we don't see it on that image there. Now, when we replace that vegetation with, say, more impervious surfaces such as concrete and asphalt, cement, it's not going to allow water to infiltrate through the ground. So you can see here, water hits those impervious surfaces and it tends to run off things like roofs and streets and parking lots. And that runoff tends to go then into our sewers. So if you notice here, we have less evaporation in this case, far more runoff and far less infiltration into the surfaces there. So urbanization overall, we know, prevents groundwater recharge and it causes precipitation to run off into local bodies of water. This can potentially over time maybe cause flooding issues. When we're preventing groundwater recharge, we know that that can affect the availability of drinking water that we find in our aquifers as well. Now, another impact on urbanization is overall an increase in carbon dioxide emissions. Some things that lead to that CO2 emissions is cement production, right? When we are building city developments, we oftentimes use things like cement, construction machinery, deforestation, right? Simply just cutting vegetation off from the land to provide more space. We know that we see a loss of future carbon sequestration. Right? Remember, we said that means it's capturing carbon. Also, the decomposition of cut trees we're also limiting. Now, and also landfills. Right? When we have a city or urban environment, there needs to be a place where all those people can throw away their trash. And so landfills are going to be needed for disposing trash. However, landfills tend to release tons and tons of carbon dioxide emissions because all of that waste is now breaking down and decomposing and releasing things like CO2 and methane, which are greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. We can also see in a landfill site that if it's not protected underneath here, if there's not a tremendous layer of clay, some contaminants can actually end up in our groundwater as well. And what does urbanization in coastal cities look like? Well, remember we talked about saltwater intrusions when we have aquifer depletion. We know population growth in coastal cities can actually lead to something like this, where we see that seawater actually penetrate into the aquifer and contaminate their drinking water in this case. We can also see a sea level rise due to the warming of ocean, due to things like global warming and climate change. We can see an increase in the melting of ice caps, as well as contaminants of fresh groundwater with salt. We can see excessive groundwater withdrawal near the coast, which we know is going to lower the water table, forcing that salt water into then the groundwater. And so we have to be very careful when we urbanize coastal cities. And oftentimes it is coastal cities that are are very promising to live near. And so that's going to get me into the topic known as urban sprawl. So this is going to be the change in population distribution from that high population density area to then more lower density suburbs. And that spread out into then rural lands, leading to even more potential environmental problems. Because way back when, people tend to live very far away from each other, typically in very rural environments. And it wasn't until, the building of cities and more urban life, people were living in much more closer quarters to one another. But over time, people didn't really want that anymore. And so that's where people started to move out to then that more rural area. And when we do that, we need to then make more roadways. We need to make more housing, more shops, just simply more resources to supply then those suburb-like areas. So here are some causes and some solutions to that urban sprawl phenomena. Here we see some causes. It's cheaper property in the suburbs, oftentimes versus larger cities. Cars make it easier to get around in the suburbs versus like city for work, entertainment, attractions. We can see a domino effect, right? When one neighbor leaves, you can probably see more leave. Fewer residents in the city leads to decline in tax revenue for that city. Residents tend to leave, so businesses may follow. And abandoned homes and businesses create blight. And that's simply just unsightly or rundown infrastructure. We can see expansion of highway systems make it much easier to travel. However, that increases driving. Increase in driving is going to increase fuel tax revenue, which then increases the building of more highways, so kind of like a positive feedback loop in that case. And that highway expansion then makes it easier and easier for people to commute from the suburbs to then urban areas, making it almost a better choice for people to then live in that suburb area versus that urban area. So some solutions to that issue would be establishing what's called an urban growth boundary. These are zoning laws that are set by cities preventing any development beyond a certain type of boundary. We could see public transport, walkable city design that is going to attract residents in order to stay and kind of still give them that suburban feel while living in an urban environment. We can also see mixed land use. What this means is we see residential businesses and entertainment buildings kind of all located within the same vicinity of one another in the area of our city. This allows it to be easily walkable, gives you a sense of place, and typically makes people want to stay there. Now in 5.13, this kind of goes along with what we said as far as impacts, right, to our urbanization. So we see that we had lots of urban runoff. So this is methods to reduce that urban runoff here. We know methods to increase water infiltration. That's our biggest issue with urban runoff, would be to replace traditional pavement with maybe more permeable surfaces, maybe planting trees, increase use of public transportation, and building up, not out. So here are just some images or solutions to urban runoff here. So if you take a look at this top picture, this would be a permeable paver. That's going to actually allow stormwater to infiltrate into that underlying soils. It promotes actually pollutant treatment and groundwater recharge. So it's almost like a natural type aquifer in this case. We can also see establishing what's known as green infrastructure and creating rain garden rendering. So planting more trees around the city, more grasses, more vegetation to help soak up that water, as well as building up and not out. Right here in this case, we were building up. We established more green roofs, which we know is a more sustainable way to establish some greenery. And so guys, take a second, pause the video, see if you can answer our multiple choice question here. As urbanization increases, natural soil surfaces are covered, the groundwater supply is reduced due to. All right guys, you should have paused the video at this point and let's see if you're correct. right? So we know as urbanization is going to increase in an area, those natural soil surfaces are oftentimes covered by impermeable surfaces. So that groundwater supply is going to be reduced to that loss of recharge because that water is unable to infiltrate the soil, unable to infiltrate the groundwater. All right, guys, make sure that you took notes as you watch this video, and please mark as done.